The wrench slipped and tore the skin off two of my knuckles before I even knew it had moved. I pressed my hand against my work jacket, felt the warm wet of it, and kept going. Pain is just information. Information means you're still alive. And on a scrapyard moon where the air smelled like burned copper and alien engine grease, alive was the only thing I had left to be proud of. My name is Dax Calloway. 6 months ago, I was the lead propulsion engineer on a Galactic Trade Authority vessel, doing runs between the inner colonies and the Keth Expanse. 6 months ago, I had a bunk, a salary, and a future. Then I found what the ship's captain was smuggling in the cargo hold. Biogenic suppressants, illegal in 43 systems, enough to poison a generation of Marin children who would never know why their lungs stopped working. I reported it. The captain had friends. I had a wrench and a record that ended that same afternoon. The Trade Authority called it insubordination. I called it the last honest thing I had done in a long time. So here I was, the scrapyard moon of Peleth 4, working for a six-limbed Trevani named Orso who paid me in meal credits and let me sleep in the corner of his tool warehouse. The work was simple. Strip salvageable parts from dead ships, clean them, tag them, stack them. Nothing that required a brain, which was probably why Orso had hired me. He did not want questions. He did not want ideas. He wanted a warm body that could carry a plasma cutter and follow orders. I had been on Peleth 4 for 14 weeks when I first saw the Verith. It was not a discovery. Everyone on the moon knew it was there. The scrapyard stretched for 6 kilometers in every direction, a graveyard of ships from a dozen dead civilizations, and right in the center of all that wreckage, barely visible through the haze of metallic dust and low Peleth cloud cover, sat something that did not belong in a graveyard. It was too big to be dead. It was too intact to be forgotten. It sat like a mountain that someone had decided to place among tombstones, and the locals stepped around it the way people step around something they cannot explain and have given up trying to. It was roughly 6 kilometers long from bow to stern, shaped like a blade that had been flattened and widened along its spine. The hull was dark, the color of deep water. It was made from an alloy I had never seen, something that seemed to drink light rather than reflect it. Every alien on Peleth 4 called it different things. The Trevani called it the sleeping curse. The Keth workers called it the old pain. Orso himself refused to look at it directly and had once told me, with complete seriousness, that the ship chose which beings it wanted to notice, and the ones it noticed tended to disappear. I thought he was being superstitious. I had grown up on Earth, in a place where superstition was something you kept in your back pocket for when science ran out of answers. It had not run out yet as far as I was concerned. What I noticed about the Verith was not fear. What I noticed was the hull plating along the midsection, which showed damage patterns consistent with a controlled power down rather than an impact or a battle. Someone had shut this ship off deliberately. Someone had chosen to let it sleep here for what the local record suggested was approximately 800 years. 800 years of Peleth dust and iron rain, and not a single scavenger had managed to pull anything off it. Not because it was impenetrable, though the hull rated well beyond anything I had ever worked on, but because, as Orso told me flatly, the ones who tried did not come back out. I had been watching it for 3 weeks before it spoke to me. I was cross-legged on a piece of flattened hull, plating from a dead Marin cargo runner, eating cold protein paste from a tin, and watching the Verith's silhouette against the gray Peleth sky, when I felt it. Not a sound. Not exactly. It was lower than sound. It was a vibration that started in my back teeth and traveled down my spine and settled somewhere behind my sternum, and it pulsed there twice like a slow heartbeat, and then stopped. I put down my tin. I looked at the ship. Nothing moved. The dust was still. The other workers 40 meters away were laughing at something one of them had said. Nobody else reacted. Nobody else even paused. I pressed my palm flat against the hull plate I was sitting on and waited. 3 seconds later, the pulse came again. Twice. Slow. Patient. I stood up. I picked up my bag with my tools. I walked toward the Verith. I did not look back. The main access port on the ship's port side had been sealed with a molecular lock that had been dead for centuries. Deadlocks are still locks, but they're honest about being locks. A deadlock is just a puzzle that has not been solved yet. I spent 40 minutes sitting in front of it with a portable power draw and a set of bypass probes before I heard a click so quiet it could have been my imagination, and the port swung inward. The air that came out was cold. Not the cold of a dead space, but the cold of something preserved. Something kept. Like the inside of the ship had been waiting in exactly this condition. Not rotting, not shifting, just holding its breath. I stepped inside. The corridor beyond the access port was 3 times my height and twice my arm span in width, and it ran in both directions further than my work lamp could reach. The walls were smooth, that same dark alloy, and along the upper edge of the corridor there were lines of small indentations. Not decorative, not random. Conduit pas. Every 2 meters, a conduit port, running the full length of the corridor. This ship had been built for efficiency at a scale that made my chest ache with something that was not quite awe and not quite envy. Something in between. I walked for a long time. The silence inside the Verith was not the silence of emptiness. It was the silence of something waiting very carefully to see what I would do next. I noticed it after the first 5 minutes, and I acknowledged it out loud, because I have always talked to ships. Ships are machines, and machines respond to attention. Not literally. Not usually. All right, I said to the corridor. I am here. What do you want? The pulse came again, stronger this time. Not from the walls. From everywhere at once, like the whole ship was a single instrument, and it had just played one note. And then a voice said, quietly and carefully, as though it had been practicing the words for a long time, I've been trying to find the correct species for 41 years. You're the first one who walked toward me. I stopped walking. I breathed. I checked my pulse by pressing 2 fingers to my wrist, a habit from early engineering training where staying calm under strange conditions was literally in the job description. You are the ship, I said. I am what remains of the ship's core intelligence. My name, in the original Prothani language, translates approximately as Oris. It means the one who listens. And you listened for 800 years. Yes. I looked around the corridor. The conduit ports along the walls had a faint glow now, barely visible, the color of starlight through thin cloud. The ship's backup power cells were still alive. Something had kept them charged. Something had been very, very patient. Why a human? I asked. There was a pause. Not the pause of something thinking. The pause of something that had been waiting to answer this question for a very long time and wanted to say it correctly. The original pilot bond protocol of this vessel requires a biological interface that matches a specific neurological pattern, Oris said. A mind that can hold 2 contradictory ideas at the same time and not collapse under the weight of them. A mind that is comfortable with uncertainty, that treats broken things as puzzles rather than losses, and that has a particular kind of patience that is different from acceptance. Humans are the only species in the known galaxy that has all 3. I have scanned every species that has set foot on this moon in 800 years. You are the first human. I let that settle. Outside, I knew. The Pelith day was moving toward its gray afternoon. I had been gone from Orso's tool yard for over an hour. He was probably already annoyed. What happened to the people who came in before? I asked. Nothing permanent, Oris said. I discouraged them. The systems I used were harmless. They simply became very uncomfortable and very strongly convinced that leaving was the correct decision. You scare them out. Yes, but not me. You walked toward me, she said. That was different. I looked down the corridor, forward toward what I knew from the exterior profile was the bow of the ship, where the bridge would be. 800 years. A ship this size, built to a standard of engineering I had never encountered, sitting here on a scrapyard moon because it had been waiting for the right person to walk through its door. Every part of my training as an engineer told me to assess what I was dealing with before I made any decisions. I knew one thing clearly already. Whatever the Verith was, whatever Oris was, whatever the Prothani had built and lost and left behind, it was the most extraordinary thing I had encountered in my entire career, and possibly the most extraordinary thing any human being had been close to in living memory. I picked up my bag. I started walking toward the bridge. I'm going to need to see the engine room first, I said, and I'm going to need better lighting. The corridor lights came on ahead of me, soft and warm, as if the ship had been waiting for exactly that request and was very glad, after 800 years, to finally provide it. Behind me, in the direction of Orso's tool yard, I heard nothing. Ahead of me, the Verith stretched out like a city that had been asleep for centuries and was just beginning to remember what it was for. What I did not hear, because I was already too far inside to notice, was the sound of footsteps on the scrapyard gravel outside, and the low voice of Hegrath, the crime lord who controlled every square meter of Peleth 4, telling one of his people to keep a very close eye on the human who had just walked into the cursed ship. I found the engine room on my third hour inside the Vareth, and I sat down on the floor in front of the primary reactor housing and just looked at it for a while. The Prothani had built their propulsion system around a resonance core, which is a concept I had read about in deep history engineering texts, but had never expected to see in person because the last resonance core anyone knew about had been stripped for parts about 400 years ago and sold to a collector on the inner rim. A resonance core does not burn fuel. It does not split atoms. It creates a sustained harmonic frequency between two gravitationally matched crystal matrices, and the energy generated by that harmonic is clean, theoretically endless, and produces a drive signature so quiet that most detection systems built in the last 3 centuries would not even register it as a ship. I pressed my hand against the housing. The crystal matrices inside were dark, but they were not dead. When Oris had said she was running on backup power cells, she had meant it literally. She had been drawing the minimum possible energy for 800 years, keeping her core consciousness alive, keeping the ship's structure from degrading, keeping everything exactly ready for the day someone worth waking for showed up. The primary matrix is intact, I said. Yes, Oris said. Her voice came from a speaker panel near the ceiling, warm and precise. The secondary matrix cracked along its eastern face approximately 200 years ago. I have been running on primary alone since then. I do not have enough power to restart propulsion at present. What do you have power for? Approximately 4 hours of conversation, life support in this section of the ship, basic lighting, and 1 use of the forward sensor array. You used the sensor array to find me, I said. I used it 3 weeks ago, yes. When you first arrived on Peleth 4, your neurological signature registered differently from everyone else. I've been sending the pulse signal every evening since then, waiting to see if you would respond. I thought about all the evenings I'd sat on that hull plate and eaten cold protein paste and stared at the ship without knowing why I kept staring. I had thought it was the engineer in me, the instinct toward interesting machinery. You were calling me, I said. Yes. I'm sorry if that was forward. I almost laughed. 800-year-old ship intelligence, last remnant of an extinct civilization, apologizing for being forward. It is fine, I said. I am here. I put my bag on the floor and started pulling things out. Portable power draw, bypass probes, a set of crystal resonance calibration tools I had built myself over 3 years from salvage components, because the manufacturer versions were 3 times the price and half as reliable. A flat patch light I mounted to the reactor housing with a magnetic clip. A notebook, actual paper, because electronics fail and paper does not. I'm going to need to understand the secondary matrix damage before I do anything else, I said. Can you display the internal schematics for this section on any screen that still works? A panel on the far wall lit up. The schematics were in Prothani, which I could not read, but the engineering diagrams were universal. Force vectors, material stress lines, resonance frequency charts. I had been reading those since I was 16 years old. I got to work. Oris talked while I worked, and I asked questions while I worked, and that was how the afternoon went. She told me about the Prothani, a civilization that had reached peak technological development approximately 1,200 years ago, before the Cascade War had consumed them over the course of 3 centuries of escalating conflict with 4 other galactic powers. The Vareth had been the last ship commissioned by the Prothani Admiralty, built in the final decades of the war, and had been given capabilities that no other ship in the galaxy could match, because by that point the Prothani were not building ships to win individual battles. They were building ships to end the war. The ship's last captain had shut it down and hidden it on Peleth for rather than use it. I did not ask why yet. I was not ready for that part of the story. I was still on the part where I had to figure out how to fix a secondary crystal matrix without any original Prothani replacement materials. I pulled up the stress fracture data on the secondary matrix and stared at it. The crack ran 43 centimeters along a crystal face that was, in total, about 2 meters across. The crystal itself was a compound that Oris identified as Vareth stone, named after the ship would have been named after it. which meant the naming had probably happened at the same time, and told me that the Prothani had a sense of elegance in their engineering vocabulary. Do you have any Verith stone in reserve? I asked. I have a small storage of raw matrix material in the supply room on Deck 7, Oris said. Approximately enough to fill the crack if applied correctly. However, the application requires heat calibration at a very specific frequency. Prothani engineers used a tool called a resonance stylus that no longer exists in the known galaxy. What frequency? She gave me a number. I wrote it down. I looked at my portable power draw, which was a modified version of standard trade authority tool that I had rebuilt twice since buying it, because the stock version was unimpressive. I had modified the output frequency range when I rebuilt it the second time, mostly out of curiosity and partly because the second rebuild had happened during a very long layover on a station with nothing else to do. I checked the range on my modified power draw. The number Oris had given me was inside the range. I can do this, I said. There was a pause. The original Prothani engineers spent 4 years developing the resonance stylus, Oris said. You have been looking at the problem for approximately 20 minutes. The Prothani engineers did not have 43 different ship systems to compare from, I said, and they probably did not have to improvise often. Improvising is a skill. It gets better with practice. Oris was quiet for a moment. Then she said, You are the strangest being I have spoken to in 800 years. I'm the only being you have spoken to in 800 years. That is true, she said, but I believe the observation still stands. I went to Deck 7 and found the supply room and the raw matrix material, which was stored in sealed containers that were still airtight after all this time, because whoever had packed them had done it properly. Good engineering never goes out of fashion. I carried the material back to the engine room and spent an hour carefully filling the fracture line with it, using a thin tool probe as an applicator, and then I held my modified power draw against the matrix housing and applied the precise frequency and held it there for 9 minutes while the material bonded and set. When I pulled the power draw back, the fracture line was gone. The crystal face was smooth. Secondary matrix integrity is reading at 94%, Oris said, and her voice had something in it that I had not heard before. Not information, not efficiency, something lighter than both. What happened to the other 6%? I asked. H, she said. Not everything can be repaired completely, but 94% is sufficient to restart the resonance cycle. Then let us start it, I said. I must tell you something first, Oris said. If you initiate the resonance cycle, the ship will power up. At partial power, the Verith's energy signature will be detectable by anyone with a standard sensor array within approximately 300 kilometers. Peleth 4 has a scanner station operated by the Keth Trade Authority on its northern ridge, so everyone will know the ship is waking up. Yes, I thought about that. I thought about Orso, who owed me 14 weeks of back wages in meal credits. I thought about the Trade Authority captain who had made sure I never worked a legitimate contract again. I thought about the Verith, sitting here for 800 years, waiting for someone who would walk toward it instead of away from it. Start it, I said. The resonance cycle came online with a sound that was not quite a sound. It was the feeling of being inside a very large instrument when it plays its first note, a vibration that moved through the floor and the walls and the air simultaneously, and the lights across the entire engine room blazed on at full power, and the reactor housing began to glow with a pale blue light that was the color of very deep, very clean water. The ship breathed. That was the only word for it. The Verith breathed. And in that moment, with reactor light filling the engine room and the crystal matrices singing their quiet harmonic and Oris's presence all around me like the feeling of a room that has been opened after a very long time, I understood something that I had not been able to put into words before. I had spent 6 months feeling like something broken that nobody wanted to fix. And this ship had spent 800 years feeling the same way. We were, it turned out, exactly what each other needed. I was still standing there, hand resting on the warm reactor housing, when Oris spoke again. Her voice was different now. Steadier, fuller, like someone speaking after a very long silence, and finding that their voice was stronger than they had expected. Dax, she said, there is something approaching the port side access hatch. Multiple contacts. Armed. I picked up my wrench. How many? I said. 6, she said. They are carrying energy weapons. The one leading them is larger than the others. He has been standing outside on the scrapyard gravel for the last 3 hours. Hegrath. Of course. I had fixed the ship's heart, but the rest of the ship was still dark and cold, and full of corridors that led in directions I had not explored yet. I had a wrench, a set of tools, and a bag that weighed about 9 kilograms. Oris, I said, can you give me the internal layout of every corridor between the port access hatch and the engine room? Already displaying on your nearest panel, she said. I looked at the schematic. I looked at my bag. I thought about the 14 weeks of bad meals and bad pay and the 2 split knuckles on my right hand, and I thought about the specific and particular satisfaction of an engineering problem that is complicated enough to be interesting. All right, I said. Tell me what tools are still in the maintenance lockers along Deck 3. I can do better than that, Oris said. I can lock and unlock every internal hatch in the ship remotely. I smiled. Not a nice smile. The kind of smile that happens when the answer to a complicated problem turns out to be simpler than expected. Then let us make this very educational for Hegrath, I said, and I picked up my bag and started moving. The next 40 minutes were not comfortable for anyone who was not me. Hegrath's team were professionals. I could tell by the way they moved in formation through the corridors and the fact that they carried proper military-grade energy weapons rather than the cheap civilian models that most scrapyard criminals preferred. They were also, every single one of them, completely unprepared for a ship that was actively working against them. Oris locked hatches in front of them and open hatches behind them. She cycled the life support in specific corridors to push warm, damp air at them, fogging their visors. She activated every functional emergency seal along Deck 2 in a sequence that sent Hegrath's team running in a wide circle for 11 minutes before they realized they had passed the same broken wall panel 3 times. I, meanwhile, had positioned myself at a maintenance intersection point on Deck 3 with a plan that would have embarrassed nobody who had ever worked cargo ship security. I used 2 magnetic clamps from my bag to attach a heavy salvage panel to an overhead rail. I connected the release mechanism to a trip wire made from communication cable I stripped from a dead panel in 4 minutes. I placed the trip wire across the corridor at ankle height, tested it once, and moved back 20 meters to wait. The first 2 of Hegrath's team came through at a run. One of them caught the wire. The salvage panel came down directly across the corridor with a sound like a ship collision. Nobody was seriously hurt, but both of them sat down very suddenly, and neither of them got up in a hurry. Hegrath himself appeared at the far end of the corridor. He was exactly as Orso had described him, large, heavy across the shoulders, with the particular posture of someone who had never in his adult life been told no by anyone who was still standing afterward. He looked at his 2 team members sitting on the floor. He looked at the panel. He looked up the corridor and found me standing there. "You," he said, "the human mechanic." "Me," I agreed. "This ship belongs to my salvage operation," he said. "Every unclaimed vessel on Peleth 4 is registered to my operation under Keth Trade Authority Code. That code applies to derelict vessels," I said. "A derelict vessel is one with no functioning systems and no active consciousness aboard. This vessel has both. It is not derelict. It is just resting." He stared at me. "It is a machine. Machines do not have legal standing." "The Prothany Pilot Bond Protocol disagrees," I said. "And since I have formally accepted the bond, I am the registered captain of this vessel under the Galactic Salvage Preservation Act of 2240, which our government signed, incidentally, as a condition of Trade Authority membership. I did not actually know if that law existed. I had made it up on the spot, but I said it with the complete calm of someone who absolutely knew it existed, which is often the more important part. Hegrath did not move for a moment. Then he said, very quietly, "You are one human with a wrench." "Yes," I said. "And you are 6 beings in a ship that does not want you here, with 2 of your people currently sitting on the floor wondering what happened. I would like you to think carefully about how this is going. Then I would like you to leave." He thought about it. I watched him think about it. Behind him, the 2 remaining members of his team who had not been stopped by the salvage panel were talking quietly to each other in a tone that sounded less convinced than they had probably been when they arrived. Hegrath turned around and left. He did not say anything else. He took his team with him. I leaned against the corridor wall and let out a long breath. "That was mostly improvised," I told Oris. "I know," she said. "I thought it was remarkable. He'll come back, I said. With more people. Yes, Oris said. He will. But by then, I believe we will be considerably more prepared than we are now. I pushed off the wall and started walking back toward the engine room. There was still so much to do. The secondary weapons systems needed to be assessed. The bridge needed power restored. The life support across the upper decks needed to be brought online. The navigation system needed calibration. The hull, plating along the midsection, had microfractures that I'd spotted on my walk-in and wanted to address properly. 800 years of work waiting to be done, and me with a bag of tools and 2 split knuckles and the particular feeling in my chest that I only ever got when a job was worth doing. Oris, I said. Yes, Dax. I'm going to need a proper workshop. What is the best space on this ship for that? She told me. I went there. I got to work. Outside, on the scrapyard gravel, Hegrath's team was regrouping. On the northern ridge, the Keth scanner station had already logged the Verith's energy signature and sent a report up the chain of command. Somewhere far away, the right people were reading that report and asking questions that had not been asked in 800 years. But inside the Verith, none of that mattered yet. What mattered was the ship and the work and the fact that for the first time in 6 months, I was exactly where I was supposed to be. The Keth Trade Authority's response arrived on the 4th day. It came in the form of an official broadcast signal directed at the Verith's communication array, which I had restored to partial function the previous afternoon using a combination of reverse-engineered Profani routing protocols and a length of secondary cabling that I had spliced myself from 3 separate dead communication lines. The signal was crisp and official and delivered in the flat, carefully neutral tone of a government functionary who had been told to keep their personal feelings out of it. The Verith and all materials aboard are hereby classified as abandoned salvage under Keth Trade Authority Regulation 7, subsection 14, the voice said. Any claim of ownership or occupancy by a non-registered individual is considered invalid. The occupant currently aboard the vessel designated Verith is instructed to vacate the premises within 48 standard hours or face legal removal. I was lying on my back under the primary navigation console when a message played, reconnecting a power feed that had corroded through a wall conduit. I listened to the whole thing. Then I sat up, wiped my hands on my jacket, and recorded a reply. This is Dax Calloway, registered captain of the Verith, responding to your Regulation 7 notice. I am going to respectfully direct your attention to the Galactic Salvage Preservation Act, specifically the clause that defines an abandoned vessel as one with no functioning onboard systems and no active register intelligence. The Verith has both. I have a witness pilot bond certification logged with the ship's own core system, which under Profani interstellar law, which the Keth Authority recognized in the Treaty of Pale Shores, which your government signed, constitutes legal captaincy. I will not be vacating. Have a productive day. I sent it and went back to the navigation console. Oris was quiet for a moment. Then she said, the Galactic Salvage Preservation Act does not have the clause you cited. Not yet, I said, but the Profani interstellar law reference is accurate, and the Treaty of Pale Shores is real. I looked it up in your archive last night. Your history files are extraordinary, by the way. You were in my archive last night. I was not sleeping. I do not sleep well when I'm excited about a project. Another pause. The Treaty of Pale Shores was signed primarily to govern interstellar trade routes, not vessel ownership, she said. It has a broad general clause in Article 9 that acknowledges Profani legal frameworks as binding on all signatory civilizations in matters pertaining to Profani-built technology. The Verith is Profani-built technology. I am therefore the captain. Oris considered this. That is an extremely creative interpretation of a centuries-old trade treaty. Creative interpretations are what lawyers get paid for, I said. I'm doing it for free, which makes it better. I finished the navigation feed connection, checked the console for power response, and got a partial display of what the forward sensor array was seeing. The scrapyard around us. The Keth scanner station on the northern ridge. And at a distance of approximately 40 kilometers, moving toward Pelith 4 at a leisurely pace that suggested they were trying not to look urgent, 3 Keth Trade Authority patrol ships. Small ones. The kind used for customs enforcement and local system policing. Not warships. I noted that carefully. If the Keth Authority had genuinely believed the Verith was a serious threat, they would have sent something larger. They were treating this as an enforcement matter, a bureaucratic problem, something that could be resolved with paperwork and the physical presence of 3 authority vessels and an eviction notice that told me everything I needed to know about how they saw me. One human mechanic in a ship they considered a derelict, a nuisance, an interesting news story, possibly, but nothing that required actual firepower. I had been underestimated before. I had learned to find it useful. Oris, I need to know the status of every system we have not powered up yet, I said. Specifically the forward weapons array. Specifically what is functional. I would encourage caution, Oris said, and there was something careful in her voice, something that was not quite reluctance, but was close to it. The weapons systems aboard this vessel are not comparable to anything currently in operation in the known galaxy. Even demonstrating their existence will change the nature of every conversation we have from this point forward. I understand that, I said. Do you? She asked. Not unkindly. Dax, I need you to understand what this ship is. It was not built for patrol operations or defense. It was not built to protect trade routes or maintain order. It was built because the Prothani were losing a war and they needed something that could threaten every combatant simultaneously. This vessel was designed to be capable of ending a civilization. The last captain who commanded it looked at that capability and chose to shut the ship down rather than use it. I sat with that for a moment. The console in front of me showed the 3 Keth patrol ships still moving toward Peleth 4. Beyond them, the deep sensor array was picking up something else, a communication burst originating from Keth space, high-priority encryption, which meant it was going to someone important. What happened to the last captain? I asked. Oris did not answer immediately. When she did, her voice was quieter. He locked himself in this room. He said the ship deserved better than what the war had made of it. He powered down every system manually, sector by sector. He put the ship into preservation mode, and he said, to me, as I was losing power, he said that he hoped whoever found me next would be someone who had the wisdom to know the difference between a weapon and a tool. The console hummed softly. Outside, 3 patrol ships. Inside, 800 years of a machine that had waited for someone who would walk toward it. What would you call this ship? I asked. Right now, a weapon or a tool. I do not know yet, Oris said honestly. That may depend entirely on you. I stood up from the navigation console and went to the forward observation deck, which I had cleared of 800 years of settled dust the previous morning and which now offered an unobstructed view of the scrapyard and the gray pellet sky beyond. I stood there and looked at the 3 patrol ships approaching and thought about what kind of person I was and what kind of person I wanted to be. I had spent my career fixing things. Engines, systems, connections that had broken or failed or been left to deteriorate by people who had stopped caring. I had never been good at walking away from a problem. I had also never been good at using a problem to hurt someone when there was another option. I did not want to fire at those ships, I said. I know, Oris said. I do not believe you would, but I want them to know what they are approaching. Not as a threat, as information. That distinction may be difficult for them to appreciate, she said. Probably, I agreed. But it is an important distinction, and I'm going to make it anyway. I went back to the communication panel and recorded a second message, this one directed at the lead patrol ship. I introduced myself again. I explained, very clearly and calmly, that the Verith was an 800-year-old Prothani Leviathan-class vessel with systems that significantly exceeded anything currently in the Keth fleet, and that I had no intention of demonstrating those systems against crewed vessels, but that I also had no intention of vacating and that legally my claim to captaincy was solid, and that I was happy to discuss this with any authorized representative of the Keth Trade Authority in a formal setting rather. Then through the medium of patrol ships approaching a ship that could, if it chose to, make their morning very unpleasant. I sent it and went to get food. I had set up a small camp in the ship's old officer mess on Deck 4, where the basic environmental systems were running well enough to keep the temperature reasonable and where I had found, to my genuine amazement, a set of Prothani storage containers in a sealed cabinet that still contained preserved provisions. Prothani biochemistry was different enough from human biochemistry that I did not eat anything in them. But the containers themselves were fascinating, and I had spent a pleasant hour the night before working out how the sealing mechanism functioned. Oris interrupted my meal 20 minutes later. The lead patrol ship has responded, she said. They are requesting a visual communication. Give them one. The officer mess had a wall panel, which I had not repaired yet, but the screen was intact, and Oris patched the signal through to it with the kind of casual competence that reminded me she had been managing ship systems for longer than any living engineer had been alive. The screen showed a Keth officer, three-eyed, pale gray skin, the careful expression of someone who had been told to handle this delicately. Captain Calloway, the officer said, with a very slight emphasis on the word captain that told me it cost them something to use it. I'm Enforcement Commander Veth of the Keth Trade Authority. We have received your communication. We are requesting that you allow an inspection team to board the vessel so that we can verify your stated claims. I appreciate the formal tone, Commander Veth, I said. I'm going to decline the inspection team on the grounds that I have not yet cleared all of the deck for safe access, and I would not want anyone to be injured. However, I am willing to transmit our ship's registration data, the pilot bond certification logs, and the specific articles of the Treaty of Pale Shores that support our position. I would also like to formally register a complaint against Hegrath, who operates the salvage yard on this moon, regarding an armed entry attempt 4 days ago. Commander Veth's three eyes blinked at slightly different intervals, which I had learned from Oris's files was a Keth expression of moderate surprise. You are filing a complaint, Veth said. I am, I said. He sent armed people into my ship. That is trespassing at minimum. There was a pause on the other end. I could hear, faintly, other voices in the background of the patrol ship's bridge. Someone saying something about treaty verification. Someone else asking a question I could not make out. We will require time to review the documentation you have referenced, Veth said finally. Of course, I said. Take all the time you need. I will be here. I have a great deal of work to do. I cut the channel and went back to my food. Oris said, they did not expect you to be reasonable. Nobody ever does, I said. Is that a human trait? It is a Dax Calloway trait, I said. I was raised by an engineer and a schoolteacher. My father fixed things and my mother explained things. I ended up doing both. I finished eating, cleaned up the containers, and went back to work. The bridge still needed 3 separate power feed restorations. The secondary hull sensors needed calibration. The lateral maneuvering thrusters, 6 of them, evenly spaced along the ship's belly, had been in standby mode for so long that their startup sequences needed to be manually verified one by one. I worked through the afternoon and into the Peleth night, which was dark and cold and smelled like iron, and Oris talked to me while I worked. She told me about the Cascade War. She told me about the other species involved, the Vreth Ascendancy, which had been the Prothenes' primary opponent and which had survived the war and grown considerably since. She told me about the other 3 species, 2 of which were now members of the Conclave of 7 that governed most of galactic civilization, and one of which had declined membership and kept to itself in the outer systems. She told me about the weapons. Not in detail, not yet, but enough. Enough for me to understand why the last captain had chosen to shut the ship down and why that choice must have cost him everything. He made the right decision for the wrong moment. I said, somewhere around the 3rd hour of the Peleth night, lying on my back under the lateral thruster control bank on Deck 9 with a calibration tool in each hand. The war needed to end, but not that way. Yes, Oris said. What would the right moment look like? She thought about it. A moment when showing power was enough. When no one needed to actually use it. That is what I thought, I said. I finished the calibration on Thruster 4 and moved to Thruster 5. Oris, when the bridge is fully restored. And I think that will take another 3 days, maybe 4. I want to take the Verith out of the scrapyard under its own power. The 3 Keth patrol ships are still maintaining a holding position 40 kilometers out, she said. I know, and when we move, the Keth scanner station will relay our position and drive signature to the full authority network within minutes. I know that too. The Veritha's drive signature, even at partial power, is unlike anything currently in the galactic database, Oris said. It will be noticed by more than just the Keth. Good, I said. I want it noticed. I want the right people asking the right questions. I want them thinking about what this ship is and what it could be, and then I want to be in the room when they have to decide how to respond to a human being who is sitting in the captain's chair of the last Prothene Leviathan. The Peleth night was very quiet. The thruster calibration tool made a small satisfied sound as Thruster 5 confirmed alignment. You are planning something, Oris said. I'm fixing something, I said. There is a difference. The plan comes after the fixing. And what are you fixing exactly? I thought about that for a moment. The scrapyard moon. The trade authority that had ended my career for telling the truth. The bureaucracies and fleets and governing bodies that had looked at humanity for 3 centuries and decided we were minor characters in someone else's story. Right now, I said, a thruster calibration. One thing at a time. Oris made a sound that I was beginning to recognize as her version of a quiet laugh. Outside, 3 patrol ships waited, 40 kilometers away, polite, patient, certain that this was going to resolve itself in their favor. 3 days later, the bridge came fully online. I sat in the captain's chair for the first time, a seat designed for a Prothany pilot, which meant it was too large for me by half, so I'd spent an afternoon rigging a set of support cushions from salvage insulation foam to bring the controls to a workable height, and I looked at the forward view screen as it flickered on for the first time in 800 years. The scrapyard spread out ahead of us in the pale Pelith dawn. Beyond it, the gray sky. Beyond that, space. All systems at your command, Captain, Oris said. Her voice through the full bridge speaker system was different from the voice in the corridors. Richer, steadier. This was the voice she was meant to have in the room she was meant to speak from. I put my hands on the controls. They responded to my touch immediately. The pilot bond working exactly the way Oris had described, the ship reading my intentions through the interface without my having to consciously direct every movement. Let us go, I said. The Verith rose from the scrapyard of Pelith 4 for the first time in 800 years. Slowly, because I was being careful, because the thrusters were newly calibrated and I wanted to feel how she moved before I asked her to do anything demanding. But she rose smoothly, and the scrapyard fell away below us, and the gray Pelith sky thinned and then was gone, and space opened up around us in every direction. I heard the 3 Keth patrol ships before I saw them on the sensor display. Their communication channel lit up with urgent traffic that was not directed at us. They were calling back to their base, updating their status, using the kind of clipped professional language that people use when they're trying to hide the fact that they are startled. Commander Veth came through on the direct channel 30 seconds later. Captain Calloway, Veth said, you are advised to hold position and await formal review. I am not holding position, I said. I am moving to a standard orbital distance from Pelith 4. I am not leaving the system. I am simply no longer sitting in a scrapyard. I paused. I also want you to know that I have completed the full documentation package for the Trade Authority review, and it is being transmitted to you now. All legal references are complete and accurate. I would also like, for the record, to note that the Verith's systems are all fully functional and that I have no hostile intentions toward any vessel in this system. A pause. Then Veth said, more quietly, Captain Calloway, what exactly is that ship? I looked at the forward view screen. The stars were very bright and very steady at this orbital distance. Behind us, Pelith 4 was a dark, cold, small thing. Ahead, the deep sensor array was showing me a spread of space that went on for distances that made 800 years seem brief. It is mine, I said, and it is in very good repair. I cut the channel and looked at the sensor display. The 3 patrol ships were holding their position. They were not approaching. They were also, I noted, no longer transmitting on their standard band. They had switched to an encrypted channel. They were calling someone senior. Good. Oris, I said, how long before the conclave of 7 has a response team in range of this system? Based on their standard response protocols, she said, approximately 9 standard days. 9 days, I said. I leaned back in the captain's chair, adjusted one of my foam support cushions, and looked at the stars. That gives me 9 days to prepare. Prepare for what? For the conversation that changes everything, I said. Because they're going to come here with fleets and lawyers and demands, and I'm going to have to explain very clearly and very calmly what this ship is, what I am, and why neither of us is going away. The Verith moved smoothly into orbital position, her drive signature singing at a frequency that was still traveling outward across the system, being picked up by scanner stations and relay buoys and the deep network of observation systems that the galactic powers had spent centuries building to make sure they always knew what was coming. They knew now. What was coming was a human mechanic in the last warship of a dead civilization, and he had brought his own tools, and he had absolutely no intention of being reasonable about this in any way that they would find comfortable. 9 days. I had work to do. On the ninth day, they came with 412 ships. I was on the bridge when a long-range sensor array picked them up, still 12 hours out, and moving at a pace that was not cautious, but was not aggressive either. Organized, deliberate. The kind of approach that announces itself loudly enough that you cannot call a surprise, but quietly enough that you cannot call it a declaration. 412 ships, from 7 different fleets representing the Conclave's member civilizations. I sat in the captain's chair and ate an energy bar I had found in my bag from 3 days ago and read the sensor data the way I had learned to read engine diagnostics. Not just what was there, but what the arrangement of things told you about the thinking of the people who had put them there. The Keth contingent was largest, 68 ships, mixed between enforcement cruisers and proper military vessels. They were also positioned at the front, which told me the Keth had spent the last 9 days arguing that this was primarily their problem and their responsibility, and they should be the ones to handle it. The Marin delegation was smaller, but their ships were the most heavily armed per unit. The other 5 civilizations range from the Trevani, 12 ships, which was generous given that Trevani are not a militarized people, to the Vreth Ascendancy, who had sent 60 of their newest battle cruisers and positioned them at the far edge of the formation in a way that said they were there for observation, but their definition of observation was flexible. The Vreth Ascendancy. Oris had spent several hours over the past 9 days telling me about the Vreth. They had been the Prothani's primary enemy in the Cascade War. They had survived the war, absorbed 3 smaller civilizations afterward, and grown into the most militarized of the Conclave's members. They had, according to Oris's historical records, very specifically and very consistently blocked every proposal in the Conclave to acknowledge Prothani-era legal frameworks as binding on modern civilizations, which meant they had been blocking the exact legal argument I had used to claim the Verith. That was not coincidence. That was 8 centuries of being afraid of a ship that still existed. They are beginning to hail us, Oris said. I know, I said. Put it through. The communication came from a Conclave arbitration vessel, a large, flat-hulled ship with the golden ring symbol of the Conclave on its hull. And the voice that came through was calm, measured, and carried the specific kind of weight that comes from representing something very large. Captain Calloway of the vessel Verith. This is First Arbiter Solon of the Conclave of 7 species. You are hereby requested to submit to a formal review board regarding your claim of captaincy over a vessel classified under Conclave Emergency Statute 9 as a prohibited class warship. Your cooperation is expected and appreciated. I leaned forward in the captain's chair. First Arbiter Solon, I said. Good morning. I have been expecting this call. I have also spent the last 9 days preparing a legal brief that I believe will address most of your statute concerns. I'm transmitting it now. I sent it. I would also like to respectfully note that Emergency Statute 9 was enacted 400 years ago, specifically in response to the discovery of a Prothani weapons depot on the Outer Rim, and was drafted without the expectation that an intact Prothani vessel with an active intelligence would ever be found. The statute does not cover this situation. I have outlined why in Section 4 of the brief. A pause. Then Solon said, You wrote a legal brief. I had 9 days, I said. I am thorough. Another pause, longer. I could hear the muffled sounds of conversation in the background, multiple voices, the particular quality of a room where people are trying not to sound alarmed while being alarmed. The Vreth commander cut in on a parallel channel without being invited to do so, which told me exactly what kind of meeting this was going to be. Calloway. The Vreth voice was flat and hard. The vessel you are aboard represents a threat to galactic stability. It will be surrendered to Conclave custody or it will be destroyed. I looked at the sensor display. 412 ships. The Vreth contingent at the far edge of the formation, their weapons arrays already warm. I could read weapon status on the sensor array now that Oris had walked me through what each reading meant, and the Vreth ships were not cold. Commander, I said, keeping my voice as level as I knew how. You just told me, in front of First Arbiter Solon and representatives of every Conclave member civilization, that you would destroy a privately owned vessel captained by a citizen of a Conclave-recognized species on the basis that it makes you uncomfortable. I want to make sure that it's formally on the record before we continue. Silence. Then Solon's voice, very carefully. Commander Vreth, this channel is archived. I let that sit for 3 seconds. I am happy to have this conversation, I said. I'm happy to cooperate with a formal review. I am happy to discuss the legal framework, the ship's history, and what my intentions are. I'm not going to be destroyed. And I want to say, clearly, that the Verith has more than sufficient capability to make that option extremely costly for everyone who attempts it. I had not fired a single weapon. I had not powered up the weapons array. I had not made a specific threat. I had simply stated a fact. The communication went quiet for almost a full minute. When Solon came back, the tone had shifted very slightly. Captain Calloway, we would like to propose a direct meeting. You, and a delegation of conclave representatives. Neutral space. No weapons active on either side. I would be happy to meet, I said. I have some conditions. We expected you might. No Vreth military representatives at the meeting table. They can observe from their ships. Hegrath of Peleth 4 is to be formally taken into conclave custody for the armed entry incident. I have the documentation. And the meeting is to be recorded and broadcast to all member civilizations in real time. I paused. I want everyone in the galaxy watching this conversation, not just the people in the room. Another pause. Then Solon said, that is an unusual request. I am an unusual person, I said, and I am sitting in an unusual ship. I think unusual requests are appropriate. The first arbiter agreed to all 3 conditions. I suspected they had not expected me to ask for a live broadcast. I suspected that was going to be the most important part of everything that followed. The meeting was set for 6 hours later, in a neutral zone between the Conclave fleet and the Verith's orbital position. I spent those 6 hours doing 2 things simultaneously. The first was finishing the installation of the bridge secondary sensor array, which I had been working on for 2 days and which I wanted fully operational before I was in a room with 400 ships at my back. The second was talking to Oris about the weapons systems in detail for the first time, not because I intended to use them, because I needed to understand exactly what I had and exactly what I was and was not willing to do with it before I sat across from a room full of people who were going to try to take it away from me. The Resonance Lance was the first weapon Oris walked me through. It generated a directed harmonic wave from the bow array that could propagate through the structural resonance frequencies of a planet's tectonic system. At maximum power and full range, it could trigger a cascade event in a planet's core from 3 astronomical units away. A planet from 3 astronomical units. The second weapon was the Tide Engine, a gravity wave pulse that could disconnect a vessel or a fleet of vessels from standard space propulsion, effectively making them drift in place. Unlike the Resonance Lance, it was not destructive. It was a disabling weapon, designed to stop without destroying. The last captain had looked at the Resonance Lance and shut the ship down. I looked at the Tide Engine and thought that someone had been very wise to build it. When was the Tide Engine added to the ship's systems? I asked. It was added in the final year of the Verith's construction, Oris said. There was debate in the Prophany Admiralty about its inclusion. Some believed that a weapon which disabled without destroying was a sign of weakness. Others argued that a weapon which could stop a war without causing additional loss of life was more powerful than any weapon that could only cause destruction. The second group won. The second group was right, I said. The last captain agreed, Oris said. He said the same thing. I sat with that for a moment. Then I stood up, straightened my jacket, which was still the same work jacket I had been wearing since Peleth 4, with the dried paint from Trevani Cargo Runner on the left sleeve and the repair patch on the right elbow, and went to meet the conclave. The arbitration space was a pressurized environment in open space, created by the conclave's arbitration vessel using field technology. I flew a small maintenance pod from the Verith, another thing I had repaired over the 9 days, and docked with the arbitration vessel, and walked into a room where 12 individuals were seated around a circular table, and every one of them looked at me with the particular expression of beings who have been told to expect something extraordinary and are still not quite prepared for it to be a human in a work jacket. First Arbiter Solon was an Irian, tall, with the characteristic pale gold coloring of their northern ancestry, and eyes that reflected light at an angle that was slightly unsettling until you were used to it. Solon stood when I entered, which I had not expected, and extended a greeting gesture that I recognized from Oris's briefing as a formal acknowledgement of legal standing. They thought my claim was legitimate, or at least they had read the brief, and they were not willing to dismiss it outright in a room that was being broadcast live to every civilization in the conclave. I sat down. I put my hands flat on the table. "Thank you for meeting with me," I said. And then, for the next 4 hours, I made the case of my life. I laid out the legal framework carefully and completely. The Treaty of Pale Shores, the Pilot Bond Protocol, the 800 years of documented ship consciousness that made the Verith an active vessel rather than a derelict. I addressed Emergency Statute 9 specifically, in detail, explaining why its language did not apply to a vessel with a living core intelligence and a formally registered captain. Then I did something that I had planned for 9 days, but that still required everything I had to do calmly. I told them what the ship was. Not what they had guessed, not what the old records hinted at, but what the Verith actually was in complete detail system by system. The Resonance Lance, the Tide Engine, the full capabilities of a Prophany Leviathan-class vessel built to end a war. I told them because the broadcast was live. Because 1,000 years from now, the record would show that the first human to sit in the captain's chair of the most powerful ship in the galaxy had told the truth about what he was holding openly in front of every civilization, instead of hiding it or using it or threatening anyone with it. The room was very quiet when I finished. Solon said, "You understand what you have described." "I do," I said, "and yet you are sitting here, not threatening, not demanding, telling us." "Yes," I said, "because that is the only way this goes somewhere good. If I wanted to use the Verith as a weapon, I would not have asked for a live broadcast." Solon looked at the other members of the delegation, then back at me. "What do you want, Captain Calloway?" I'd spent 9 days thinking about that question. I had thought about it in the engine room, in the corridors, in the captain's chair during the long Peleth nights. I had thought about what my father would have said, because he had spent 40 years repairing industrial machinery in a city that most people had given up on, and his answer to that kind of question had always been the same. "I want to do the job," I said. That ship was built by people who understood something that got lost in the war. A weapon that can destroy is just a weapon, but something powerful enough that no one will ever challenge it, used in service of something that everyone agrees matters, that is something different. I want the Verith to be a neutral space, a place where disputes get resolved without fleet deployments, where civilizations can come when they are out of options. I want it to be useful, and I want the galaxy to understand that a human built that, because I'm tired of being told my species is a minor detail in someone else's story. The room was quiet again. The broadcast was live. Somewhere, in every corner of the known galaxy, this conversation was being watched. Solon said, "That is not what we expected you to say." "I know," I said, "but it is what I am saying." The legal proceedings took 11 days. They were not straightforward. The Vreth delegation filed 3 separate objections, 2 of which were dismissed, and 1 of which required a full treaty review that kept 12 arbitration clerks busy for 4 days straight. Hegrath was taken into custody on day 2, exactly as agreed. The live broadcast of the arbitration sessions generated the largest viewership in conclave communication history, according to Oris, who was monitoring the network traffic from the Verith with considerable interest. On the 3rd day of proceedings, the first human delegation arrived in the system. Not an official government delegation. There was no official human government at the galactic level, which was something I intended to think about after this was resolved. It was a civilian ship, a small transport, carrying 6 humans who had chartered it specifically to come and witness what was happening. They parked in a respectful distance and watched. By the 6th day, there were 40 human ships in the system. By the 11th day, there were over 200. They did not do anything. They did not make demands or hold demonstrations or interfere with the proceedings. They just watched. And the galaxy, which had been watching the proceedings and which was now also watching 200 human ships gather quietly in a system where one human was making a legal case about a very large ship, began asking questions that it had not asked before. Questions about humans, about what we were capable of, about whether minor species had ever been the right description for a species that had, in 14 weeks on a scrapyard moon, fixed a vessel that 8 centuries of galactic civilization had failed to approach. On the 11th day, the ruling came. It was complex, as all significant legal decisions are, with multiple sections and subsections, and a specific note from Solon in the preamble acknowledging that the existing legal framework had required substantial creative interpretation to address a situation it had not been designed for. But the conclusion was clear. My claim of captaincy was valid. The Verith was my ship. I was back on the bridge when Oris told me the ruling had been issued. I was 3 hours into a repair on the lateral sensor array, which had developed a calibration issue 2 days ago that was irritating me. We won, Oris said. Good, I said. Hand me the calibration wrench. The secondary model, not the primary. A panel slid open near my right hand. The calibration wrench was inside. Oris had been learning where I preferred my tools over the past 3 weeks. You do not seem very excited, she said. I'm very excited, I said, finishing the calibration. I just also need to fix the lateral sensor array. The conclave is broadcasting the ruling on all channels, Oris said. There are currently 304 human ships in this system. I know. The Vreth commander has filed a formal protest. Of course he has. I sealed the sensor array housing and climbed down from the panel. He will file it every year for the next century, probably. That is fine. The ruling is the ruling. I walked to the captain's chair and sat down. The forward view screen showed the conclave fleet still present, now clearly in the process of beginning their long withdrawal from the system. The human ships were visible on the sensor array, a cluster of small lights that had gathered not because anyone told them to, but because they had been watching and they had needed to see. Oris, I said. Yes, Captain. When we're done here, when the arbitration is fully closed and the legal record is filed, I want to take the Verith to the first location we discuss establishing as a neutral arbitration point. I want the first formal session to be about the Vreth Ascendancy's expansion into the Marin border systems, because that has been unresolved for 60 years and both sides have been waiting for somewhere safe to talk. Can you pull the relevant background on that dispute? I've already started, Oris said. You will have a full briefing by morning. And I want to send a message to the 304 human ships in this system. What would you like to say? I thought about it. About my father, who fixed things. About my mother, who explained things. About 6 months on a scrapyard moon eating cold protein paste and being small and forgettable. About an 800-year-old machine that had been waiting for someone to walk toward it instead of away. Tell them, I said, that being underestimated was useful while it lasted, but we do not need it anymore. Tell them the Verith is a neutral ship now, not a human ship, but that a human runs it, and that is not going to change. Tell them to go home, take care of their families, do their work well, and understand that the galaxy is watching now, and what it sees from us going forward is on all of us. Oris was quiet for a moment. That is a long message. I know. Send it anyway. The Verith moved in her orbital path, steady and quiet, her systems running at full efficiency for the first time in 8 centuries. 304 human ships blinked on the sensor display like a small constellation. The conclave fleet was withdrawing slowly, deliberately, in the organized way of people who are being dignified about a situation that has not gone exactly the way they planned. Somewhere far away, in a dispute that had been running for 60 years, 2 civilizations were going to be told there was somewhere they could go to talk. I picked up my calibration wrench and started on the next item on my repair list, because the work was never done, and that was the part one had always loved most about it. You know, Oris said after a while, in the quiet voice she used when she was about to say something she had been holding for a long time, the last captain left a message in my core archive. I had been debating whether to share it. I stopped. What did he say? He said that the ship deserved a captain who knew the difference between power and purpose. He said he hoped, when the time came, that whoever found me would already know which one mattered more. I looked at the stars on the forward view screen. They were very steady and very bright. He was a good captain, I said. He was. Oris agreed. So are you. The galaxy had spent 800 years afraid of this ship. It had taken 1 human, a bag of tools, 14 weeks, and a legal argument about a 400-year-old trade treaty to turn it into something that mattered for a completely different reason. We were funny like that.